Okay, good morning everyone, and you're all very, very welcome. And I would just, I suppose one of the things that when I was thinking about this session today, I thought, my goodness, this is the last one of the year, and 2020, what a year that has been. Today we were, wanting to talk about remote volunteer management, and I suppose in the year what we've been doing is learning to do things differently, managing differently, leading differently. And the words of the Bette Midler song, From a Distance, comes to mind. You'll be glad to know I'm not going to sing it. But what has remote volunteer management looked like from a distance? What has recruiting, training, inducting, supporting, what has all that looked like from a distance? And I suppose one of the things, did you lose your sense of team? Or maybe did you lose your team altogether? Motivation is something that we are very, very we see that as key to everything around volunteer management. We talk about the motivation of volunteers to volunteer, but we also talk about how you as volunteer managers motivate your volunteers. So this morning is really about looking at what that looks like from a distance. I just want to say before I hand over to George, who's going to lead the session for us, is that the representation today is absolutely fantastic. The turnout is brilliant, and I don't have time to go around and introduce everybody, but just to say that today, we have people who represent organisations that work with disability, with the environment, with culture, mental health, with animals, with victims, with newcomers, women, education, young people, children, criminal justice, health, emergency support. And that's not them all. Apologies to anybody that I've left out. But it just shows how important volunteers are, and that they are in absolutely everything, in every area we do. So George, I just want you to, share some thoughts with us and help us think through some of these issues. And then we're going to divide into smaller groups just to reflect on some of the thoughts that George will have posed. And then we'll come back into the big group and give you an opportunity to ask more questions or just to comment. So George, if I hand over to you.
Thank you, Sandra, and a very good morning, everybody. Delighted to be with you this morning, and volunteer organisations linking together. I don't think there's anything better that we do here in Northern Ireland. It's something that we're really good at in terms of working alongside one another. Just to start us off, the campaign Together We Can through volunteering is one of the best messages that has come out during this year. Something really, really positive, and as Sandra has alluded to, it's fantastic to see so many different organisations with so many different causes joining us here this morning. And I love this image in terms of what motivates volunteers to volunteer, and it is the impossible. We call the action, we send out messages to encourage volunteers to join our cause, to share our message, to deliver services and projects. And in normal circumstances, we would never, employees of any organisation would never be able to do what we do without the involvement of volunteers. And it's really encouraging that we can put out that message and that volunteers always do answer the call. And as we really noticed this year in terms of the new trends of volunteering, and when we refer to the new trends of volunteering around episodic volunteering and spontaneous volunteering, and who would know between April and May of this year that 4,500 people in Northern Ireland would step forward to really help not only communities but organisations like ourselves to continue to try and deliver services in these most difficult times. And when we talk about remote management and when we talk about motivation, I'm sure we will all agree now that we sit in December, it's actually difficult to try and motivate ourselves after such a long, difficult year. And we as a profession have to continue to try and motivate our volunteers as well through this difficult time. So I'm going to share some ideas in terms of pieces of research that I've looked at right across the globe in terms of how organisations are continuing to remotely manage volunteers and indeed keep those motivations up. But I always do like to remind people of the three key motivations as to why people actually do get involved in volunteering. And volunteers can come to your organisations with all of these motivations. They can come with one of the motivations, or indeed through their lifetime of volunteering, dip in and dip out of each of these motivations. So when we refer to intrinsic, it is about making that difference and really wanting to help. And I refer to the 4,500 spontaneous volunteers that intrinsically were motivated to come and help organisations and communities and societies during this very difficult time. The social element of it, and that's where volunteering brings that pleasant atmosphere. It allows people to meet other people and indeed to make new friends, and that can continue virtually. And we have had the pleasure in terms of during these Volt sessions and indeed through all the training that we've been delivering during this year to meet new people, to work with new organisations and indeed meet new friends. So the opportunity motivation also leads into young people, and we think of young people and their university experiences at the moment and not having that social element and turning to volunteering to not only to support their career development and to learn new skills and to become more employable for the future, because we all recognize that the recovery of this pandemic will probably lead to vast redundancies. It will probably lead to not many opportunities for young people made redundant, looking at new career paths. All of those motivations will come pre-COVID when that happens. So as organisations, I think it's really, really important that we understand and continue to recognise why volunteers do volunteer. And if we tap in to either one or all of these motivations, then they are fantastic tools to enable us as volunteer managers to continue to manage our volunteers remotely and continue to do things to encourage that motivation and keep that motivation going. When we send out messages for recruitment and when we ask volunteers to get involved with our organisations, there's key messages that we make use of, and that is about, signing up, get involved, come forward, speak up, have your voice, make that difference. And it's really important for us as organisations and practitioners to really understand when we put those messages out there that they are so important that we follow through on those messages. And unfortunately, yes, in this year, we have had to do that remotely. We've had to continue to try and keep our volunteers motivated, and more so probably than previous years, because as Sandra has alluded to, some of us may have lost our volunteer teams. Some of us may have all of our volunteering stood down. But as managers and coordinators in organisations, we have still the responsibility to continue to allow our volunteers to have that voice and really still participate in the cause of the organisation, and allowing them to step forward and bring their ideas and creativity and innovation to our organisations during this time of change. We all know that change is difficult, but we can support change by letting our volunteers be involved in that change to move forward through the next few months and indeed well into the future. So I've come up through my research with quite a number of tips. Some of these will probably not be new to you, and I suppose that's about reinforcing, that we still need to continue to do what we always do as volunteer managers. So, you know, these tips are about offering you ideas to continue to successfully and remotely manage your teams. And for some of us, yes, we may be a part-time volunteer coordinator, a part-time volunteer manager, whose capacity isn't always there to be able to have that daily check-in. But there's so many ways that we can continue to do that daily check-in with our volunteers. And probably the most important way is by communicating a lot. And communication with a purpose, not just for the sake of communicating, having a purpose, a message that will interact with your volunteers, that will motivate them to come back and engage with you. And, you know, technology, yes, is a wonderful thing. We're all Zoomed out, we're all WhatsApped out, we're all emailed out, you know, but we need to take into consideration as well those people that don't have internet connection. And I always believe in going back to where we first began, you know, with the mobile phone. Texts, you know, we can't assume that all of our volunteers will have an email address. We can't assume that they will all have a really good internet connection, but 99% of them will have that phone. So it's thinking about how are we communicating with all of our volunteers. If we're doing it by email, are we also sending a text to our volunteers that don't have an email address? It's that consistent flow of communication and those consistent messages. So that's about taking advantage of technology in these given times, but also remembering that not everyone has the same resource to technology as we do as organizations and as other volunteers might have. It's about managing those expectations, you know, for volunteers that perhaps are maybe at the moment stood down and thinking about what will the new volunteering look like for them, and beginning to think as practitioners and as organizations how we're going to begin to manage those expectations of volunteers. Are we rewriting their role descriptions? Are we developing new roles? And if we're doing that, are we informing all of our volunteers of these new roles, these new expectations, these new aims and objectives that our organizations are potentially looking at well into the future? It is probably the time at the moment to be really thinking and focusing on outcomes, not necessarily the activity, but thinking about what the outcomes you want to see coming from your future programs and your future projects, and indeed your future roles that complement the roles of your PED staff within your organization. We also need to resource our volunteers teams. You know, we've had many challenges through this pandemic where potentially we've had to have PPE for our volunteers. We've had to ensure that there's hand sanitizers. We've had to ensure that they're keeping to their 2 minutes, their 2 meters social distancing. You know, so now as we have resourced this pandemic, we need to think about how we're going to resource the future as well with our volunteer team. And there will be a degree of flexibility. And it's not about putting too much pressure on your shoulders. It's about being flexible with that approach and thinking, let's take this stage by stage, but continue to involve our volunteers operationally and strategically. You know, these guys, all our volunteers potentially have been doing these roles for many years potentially before we even came into the organization. So they know how to do things on the ground. They know how to operationally, you know, step forward and make change. So encourage and include them in the way you're thinking of how you're going to move forward through the pandemic and post the pandemic as well. Equip your volunteers and make sure your volunteers have that technology that they need to be successful, which may be more than just that mobile phone and that laptop. You know, as I've alluded to earlier, there may be different things that your volunteers will require now if you are thinking about changing roles. Is there different policies that you potentially have to be looking at now, or revisiting your policies within your organization? And that may be your lone working policies. It may be, thinking about that flexibility of how we're going to engage our episodic volunteers and how we're going to engage our spontaneous volunteers more into that longer type role. So you may, as organizations, have to look at different resources. You may have to also look at resourcing new training programs for some of your volunteers. So it's about taking your plans strategically and operationally, looking at the roles you have now, how they're changing, what they're going to look like in the future, and what you're going to need to resource everything that you plan to do post the pandemic, and indeed currently during the pandemic. Promote dialogue between your volunteers, and I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail as we go through the session. But really engage with all of your volunteers, not siloing them into their individual roles, because if we're eventually looking at developing new roles and actually changing some roles, bring all of your volunteers together. Not just bring one set of befrienders together and then your fundraising volunteers and whatever other type of roles you might have. Bring them together, mix them, and offer that dialogue for them all to learn from one another, because you may find that volunteers potentially that have been in a role for a long time no longer want to continue with that role. They want something new because their circumstances have changed. So by dialoguing with all of your volunteers, they may pick up ideas from other volunteers as well. Trust in your volunteers. Really trust them. They are the people who, as I've said, are operationally delivering. So let them have their voice. Reinforce your organizational values. We continually talk about motivation and how we motivate our volunteers. And the most important thing when it comes to motivation is ensuring that the volunteer roles that we develop, the volunteer roles that we relook at and revitalize, meet with the aims and objectives and values of our organizations. And they may change, and they may have already changed. So it's about reinstating your values to all of your volunteers. Use objectives really to create that clarity. So if your objectives and your aims have changed within your organization, offer that clarity to your volunteers and ensure that there is still a place for them in your organization, but the objectives in terms of how you're going to deliver your programs have changed. Focus on those outputs and not processes. Sometimes we get bogged down in the bureaucracy, the forms, the registrations, the inductions, which are always important. But going back to the previous slide and thinking about focusing on your outcomes, it's also about focusing on your outputs. Increase that recognition. Thank you. Anyone that attends my training knows that I really promote that thank you. It doesn't take an awful lot to say thank you to our volunteers, and that is still so important. And given the time that we're in, the festive period, now is the time for the virtual Christmas cards. Now is the time for the virtual coffee mornings, and think of all these things. Just because we can't come together face to face, we know we can still do this now virtually. We can send our virtual Christmas cards. So always remember about that recognition and that thank you for bearing with us, continuing, changing from one role to another role while we serve our local communities and the people that we work with. Encourage that innovation. That is a key factor when it comes to motivation. Innovation and creativity. We all have it in abundance, but we don't know it unless we ask. And that's vitally important. We talk about communication with a purpose. Always have that end purpose when we're communicating, not just for the sake of it. Ask for innovation from your volunteers. Ask for creativity from your volunteers. That will motivate them. That gives them a sense of belonging, a sense of understanding, and a sense of value that you place on them within your organization. Be Collective, our new volunteer management system, there's many things that Be Collective can do, and I learned more about Be Collective the other day from one of our members of staff who gave our team some training, and I was really encouraged by it. This message button, I just love message, and and how we can actually communicate through our Be Collective. And for any organization that's on this call this morning or on this session, if you're not part of Be Collective, our new volunteer management system, please engage with us, and we will send out some information in terms of our community engagement officers and support officers who can support you to get on Be Collective. It's a fantastic remote system. It allows you to do so much, and I will not say that I know it inside out, and that's why you're better speaking to the specialists after this short session. But through Be Collective, you can actually contact your entire membership en masse. You can send messages through our system, and your members can be your members, your staff, your volunteers, your board members, your supporters, and you can actually send messages to all of those through Be Collective. That really good slick line of communication that you can engage with everyone through an online platform, and your volunteers can then engage back with you as well. On the main summary tab of the group page, you can write articles. You can also do clear calls to action. If you are, let's say, looking to do a flag day in January, or when we get back to normal, you can put that call out to all of your volunteers, not just your fundraising volunteers. Think about trying to encourage all of your volunteers to know what all of the roles are within the organization. So when you're putting calls of action out, or when you're putting messages out, don't do it to the select few, do it to the mass, do it to all your volunteers, so as they're aware of what's going on throughout the whole organization. So there are many ways that Be Collective can support you as a volunteer manager and a volunteer coordinator, and also obviously by advertising your volunteer opportunities. But as I've said, I'm not the expert in this, so we will furnish you with the contact details for anyone who isn't on Be Collective thereafter. But you can also partner, I believe, with other organizations in Be Collective, so like-minded organizations. So there's a number of cancer charities. You can partner with each other, learn from one another, bring your volunteers together, share. We're about sharing in the volunteering community sector, and let volunteers from one organization learn from other volunteers in another organization with a similar mindset. This is what keeps motivation going. This is where volunteers can learn, and we can learn from one another by partnering with one another. And there is a way of doing that through Be Collective and remotely. So in terms of the virtual volunteering, and the idea is to engage your volunteers remotely, encourage your volunteers to lobby your cause. If volunteers are inactive and their roles are stood down at the moment, they can continue to really lobby for your cause through social media, through their own connections. If you're putting out a clear message, if you're doing a recruitment drive, get everyone involved. We talk about concentric circles. We talk about the ripple effect in terms of, if you volunteer, your friends may volunteer, your family may volunteer. So if you're doing a recruitment drive within your organization, let everyone in the organization know that you're doing that, including your existing volunteers, because they will drive the message. Encourage your volunteers to support other organizations in difficult times as well. Many moons ago, a long time ago, I remember doing some work with some charity shops, and that is a difficult area at the moment. And a few charity shops in one local street, and we know some of our high streets that there are a number of charity shops, and they were having a real difficulty in terms of having enough volunteers to put shifts into their charity shops. So what they collectively done as a group of 6 charity shops was went out and recruited volunteers, not just for their one charity shop, but for the 6 charity shops. And they set up a flexible rota. And it meant then that volunteers were not fixed to one organisation. If Cancer Focus needed a volunteer on a particular day, there was a flexible rota that someone who may have been volunteering for the Simon Community Shop was able to dip in and support Cancer Focus and fill a shift for them. So it's about coming together in terms of volunteers supporting one another through organisations and not becoming fixated that these are our volunteers and we don't want them to go anywhere else. If we come together as we do in the voluntary and community sector, the degree of flexibility that will come from that will only allow us to continue with motivating and managing our volunteers remotely. Start an ambassador program. You know, some of your volunteers potentially may never return to volunteering, and they may not see a fit for themselves in the new era that we're coming into. But they are probably your strongest advocates. They are the person who potentially could be selling your organization to the mass. Create this ambassador program. Tell them, no, you're not redundant. Your role is not redundant. You have all of the experience. Would you be open to going and speaking? Would you be open to informing other organizations and other people about our cause? You know, put them on a pedestal. You know, they have served you for a long, long time. Get them involved in the ambassador program, give them a few techniques in terms of how they can get your message out there and spread the message. And they can do that from home. This can be done remotely as well. You know, so there's many different ways that we can still encourage volunteers potentially that may not be part, that can still be part. Utilize those volunteer skills. Offer that listening campaign and host virtual classes. Build your community. You know, build your community with other organizations. Spread the message that, you know, volunteering is for everybody. There is a place in all of our organizations for volunteers. If they don't fit your organization, spread the message to your partners. You know, there's so much that we can do collectively, virtually, and we've done that this year through these vote sessions, linking one another together, listening to each other's ideas. Let's continue with that. You know, let's all come together through our remote sessions, through our Zoom sessions, through all of our social media, and continue this engagement, but not just with us, our volunteers as well. Bring our volunteers to the forefront, listen to them, listen to their innovation, and listen to their creativity. So my colleague Julianne is now going to split us into groups, okay? I think we're potentially going to go into 6 groups. We're going to have 15 minutes. And what I would like is to focus on are these 2 particular questions. And the other thing I would like you to do is nominate a volunteer. Isn't that fantastic? We're going to nominate a volunteer to feed back to the whole group after the 15 minutes. So it's really about coming together and learning and sharing ideas of how we as practitioners and managers have made changes in our organizations to manage our volunteers remotely. And the other question is, what have you changed in your organizations to keep your volunteers motivated remotely? And let's learn from one another and share all of the good practice that we know we have embedded in our organizations to support one another. So I'm going to ask Julianne that we'll all just fly off into our breakout rooms. And then you'll be kicked out after 15 minutes, and then we'll all come back together. And if you have that nominated person to share all of the wonderful ideas that we all have with the entire group when we come to the end of the 15 minutes, that would be great. So thank you for that. And I think you're going to move into your breakout rooms now. Welcome back, everybody. For those of you that were on, you might have overheard me saying, oh, Jules, I've lost you. I need my mummy. Don't we always go back to our mummies? But thankfully, we are all back together. So I'm going to drop the share screen down, stop sharing my screen so that I can see most people here. And then what we'll do is we'll start our feedback, if that's okay. That's better. Celebrity Squares has returned. We can see everyone now. So I think there was 6 breakout rooms. Is that right, Julianne?
Sorry, I was muted. 5, George.
5. Okay. So if we can start with breakout room 1, and the volunteer from breakout room 1 who's going to feedback their ideas, that would be great. I think that was you, Norma, was it?
No, I think me. Well, we were in breakout 1. We actually had a bit of a discussion just introducing ourselves and you know, saying what our job role in that was, before we sort of discussed some of the questions. So the first question, what changes have you made into your organisation to manage volunteers? The consensus was actually that the volume of volunteers had really grown, and most of sort of my breakout room had said that the staff really felt a bit burned out because they were trying to place some of those volunteers, and that was difficult. One organisation has partnered with other organisations with regards to sort of, you know, transferring those volunteers. They had like a befriending, an organisation who were looking for telephone befrienders, and that particular organisation didn't have that facility, so they were able then to, you know, encourage their volunteers and transfer them on to this other charity so that they could potentially come a volunteer befriender. I've said to my sort of room, if I've missed anything, to please chirp in, you know. So
you'll never miss anything, Wenda.
And what to keep the volunteers motivated, some of the organisations have one-to-one meetings, and they've arranged coffee mornings, sort of to keep in contact. So communication was a big issue right across to ensure that they kept communicated with their volunteers. Through newsletters, so through meetings, just general sort of, you know, communication with them, just keeping in contact basically with all the volunteers to make sure that they felt valued and that they weren't forgotten about. So I'm not sure if I've missed anything. If I've missed anything, no, team, let me know. So
that's great, Wenda. Partnering, you know, it's fantastic to hear that partnering coming out. You know, as we all know, we all can't do it alone. And as I alluded to at the very beginning of the session, you know, we're finding it difficult to motivate ourselves, and then we have to transform that demotivation into motivation to then motivate our volunteers as well. So it's difficult for everyone, and especially when you're doing it online. But communication is probably one of the most important areas, but as I said, communication with an outcome and communication with a purpose is really, really important in terms of keeping that communication flowing. So thanks for that, Wenda. Breakout room 2 then.
Now it's me, George.
Sorry, Norma, now it's you.
You're fine, you're fine. So we had discussion in our group and around managing volunteers. The Zoom meetings and Teams meetings, as you would expect, but one group was doing one-to-one meetings on Teams with their volunteers, which had been, you know, taken up in some cases and not in others. You know, some volunteers wanted to do it and others didn't. I suppose some of them felt it was maybe a wee bit too formal. But it wasn't intended to be like that. It was intended to be informal. Phone calls and email communication, and we kind of like the idea of phone calls because it is kind of more personal than your emails, and I suppose it depends very much on like how many volunteers you have, whether it's feasible to make regular phone calls to all of them. And also a couple of us are with charities that work with people with hearing loss, so phone calls maybe aren't necessarily the best method of communication. But in those Zoom meetings, people are trying to increase the interactivity, maybe using the breakout rooms and having some sort of icebreakers and stuff like that, and activities for people to get involved in. So that's how people were managing volunteers. In terms of motivation, we've had virtual quizzes using Kahoot online, virtual coffee mornings, virtual meetings where you can see everyone. Again, that depends on your demographic, your volunteer demographic. Some of our volunteers, for example, would be older and maybe not using online so much, and it's how to do things that where you can include them as well. But one of the things that we have planned is to do a digital audit of our volunteers and try to provide them with equipment, internet access and training to upskill them, enable them to get involved if they want. Some may not want to, but we're going to do that audit by telephone because we feel that it's important to try and encourage those who maybe wouldn't automatically go that route to try to get involved.
It's a bit like back to basics, isn't it? You know, back to the old telephone and back to the face-to-face and the one-to-ones.
And particularly to engage those volunteers who maybe you can't engage otherwise.
Indeed.
You know what I mean? It can be tricky enough. And a couple of us are having virtual Christmas parties. I'm going to let Kate explain what they're doing for their Christmas party because it just blows my mind. And some of us are sending out handwritten festive cards with a gift card as an alternative to a Christmas party this year. Great. So Kate, go ahead because I just can't cope with it.
Okay, yeah, well, we've yet to see whether or not it'll work. So I work with Hearing Link, and most of our volunteers are hard of hearing, have got severe or profound hearing loss. But we're having a virtual Christmas party over Teams, and we're going to set up some breakout rooms that will mirror a kitchen and the hallway and the lounge. And we're going to have a silent disco and scavenger hunt and things like that. So we'll see how it goes. It could be a complete flop or it could be fun. We'll just have to wait and see.
Sounds great. People will be motivated to attend. I must get that link, Kate. Sounds great. Sounds great. Moving on then to breakout room 3.
I didn't pay attention. Was that us? Sorry, apologies. I didn't look at the number. We had a number of discussions with regards to how difficult it is to involve people in remote volunteering, and it very much depends on what your organisation is. One of the organisations was Belfast Lock Sailability, and that's for people with disabilities. So they're very hands-on and have found it difficult to engage in any way with regards to how they keep in touch with volunteers, how they can actually physically motivate volunteers to attend. One of the first comments was from Helen, I think, with regards to they have been having regular online coffee mornings, and we were just saying how, well, for me, I have quite a number of volunteers, and it's always difficult to keep in touch anyway with regards to face-to-face and things like that. But I actually think, although the pandemic has been an absolute nightmare, this could be a way forward for us, for me as an organisation, as to how we motivate our volunteers to stay in touch. Because normally, you know, with us, the only time our volunteers get together is once a year when we have a recognition event. They don't see each other because they're all different shifts, they're all different hospitals, they're all over. So I think Helen's idea of the virtual coffee morning is actually really good. You can attend if you wish, you can participate if you wish. So there's no pressure, and it's not about volunteering, it's just general chit chat, those types of things as well. So I think we all agreed that was a good idea with regards to keeping volunteers involved. And I
think that, you know, that partnering with like-minded organisations, you know, in terms of your own, you know, your health trusts, maybe linking with different trusts and their volunteers and bringing them together for a chat and a coffee, you know, just to learn from one another. And that will build motivations in terms of them knowing what's going on in other trusts as well. So
I suppose the last thing that we kind of found was key was communication, keeping in touch with our volunteers. One of Liliana, I think it was, said that their staff were furloughed, which meant that right at the start they were not allowed to contact volunteers, and one of the main things that came out after they were allowed to get back into work and make contact again was, well, we haven't heard from you, you know, you haven't been in touch. So that led to obviously demotivated, lack of interest, lack of wanting to be involved, perhaps moving elsewhere to volunteer where they felt more supported. So communication is definitely something that, with regards to both managing and motivating the volunteers, to make sure that you're retaining and you're also keeping them, you know, engaged with your organisation.
Indeed.
I think that was it. Is anybody else going to add from that group?
That's great, Wendy. As all these sessions do, we're running very, very close to time. We're just at our hour. So if I could just very quickly ask someone from Breakout Room 4 just to feedback anything different that hasn't been raised.
Yes, I'll feedback. Can everybody hear me okay? I've had mic problems. Is that hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, absolutely. Because I was going to say that we were coming up with the same things. We also found that what was being changed was actually linking into number 2, that the reason things were changing was because they needed to change to keep the volunteers motivated. So they were kind of really interlinking. So, okay, so anything different? There was a couple of wee things offering online training and self-care sessions such as yoga and other online therapies, sending out the Christmas cards, and those would, to be honest, be the 2 main ones. Also holding Christmas workshops and sending out the packs so people could interact online, doing something physically together.
Great. Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that, Jamie. And finally, Breakout Room 5.
Hi, I'm David. Nice to meet you all. Not very much that hasn't already been touched upon, you'll probably be thankful to hear. But some of the people were again worried about, particularly with befriending things with older people. That was quite problematic with phone calls as opposed to face to face. We actually spent 10 minutes introducing ourselves to each other and didn't get much talked about, to be honest. But I think the main thing that came out of it with volunteers is contact. Yeah. Just keeping in contact with volunteers. Personally, I work with ESOL classes, and since we've been online, I still pop in for the last 10 minutes to every class.
Yeah. To
see how it's going, and it keeps the teachers, keeps everybody together. We do. And we have meetings every 3 or 4 weeks to work out. I think there's a lot of contact issues. I don't know if I probably missed something. So if anybody else from the group wants to chip in, I'll be grateful.
Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Summarizing, I suppose, in summary, we all agree communication is vitally important, but it is understanding and recognizing that we need to communicate with all of our volunteers, and that may be in different forms. It may be one-to-one, it may be by telephone, it may be the text. It's recognizing that not everyone has the wherewithal to be able to communicate through the internet, and just keeping that up. Focus on activities, think of activities, but really going forward, ensure that your volunteers are involved both operationally and strategically with how the organisation is moving forward. They will be creative and they will have innovative ideas. So really encourage you to encourage partnership, and indeed listening to your volunteers as well. So thank you very much. I hope you've got some tips from that. You will all get a copy of the slides, and this session is being recorded as well. And I'm going to hand back to Sandra. So thank you very much, everyone.
Well, just to say thank you very much to George, and to thank everybody for your participation today. As I said at the start, this is the last one of the year. We will be sending out our January schedule very soon, so watch out for that. I don't know about anybody else, but I wish I hadn't mentioned the song From a Distance, because it's going on in my head and will be with me for the rest of the day. Hopefully not for the rest of Christmas. But from a distance, can I wish you all a very happy Christmas and a better and different 2021. So take care of everybody, and keep in touch with us, because communication is key. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.